Picture yourself walking through the Scottish highlands on a misty morning, where ancient stones tell stories of a time when survival meant everything. The medieval period in Scotland wasn't just about famous battles or legendary heroes, it was about ordinary people facing extraordinary challenges every single day. This land of mountains and valleys shaped its inhabitants into some of the most resilient people in European history. Before we begin this journey through Scotland's medieval past, if you enjoy these soothing historical explorations, please like the video, subscribe to History Candle and ring the notification bell for more peaceful journeys into the past, and write in comments from which country you're watching this video. Medieval Scotland existed as a complex society where power shifted constantly between different groups. Local strongmen controlled territories through force rather than law. The concept of a unified nation barely existed. Instead, regional leaders commanded loyalty through personal relationships and military strength. These power structures created a society where violence became normalised as a method of resolving disputes. The geography of Scotland played a crucial role in shaping medieval life. Mountains created natural barriers between communities, leading to isolated populations developing their own customs and dialects. Rivers served as highways for trade, but also as boundaries that sparked territorial disputes. The Western Islands operated almost independently from mainland authority, developing maritime cultures that differed significantly from inland communities. Food production in medieval Scotland required incredible ingenuity. The short growing season meant farmers had to maximise every opportunity for cultivation. They developed unique agricultural techniques, including the run-rig system, where land was divided into strips and redistributed annually among community members. This ensured everyone had access to both good and poor quality soil, creating a form of agricultural equality within communities. The Scottish medieval diet relied heavily on preservation techniques. Salt became precious for preserving fish and meat through long winters. Smoking, drying, and fermenting foods allowed communities to survive when fresh produce was unavailable. Honey served as the primary sweetener and medicine, making beekeepers valuable members of society. Wild foods like mushrooms, berries, and herbs supplemented cultivated crops, requiring extensive knowledge of local flora. Housing in medieval Scotland reflected both available materials and defensive needs. Stone construction was rare outside major settlements. Most people lived in structures made from timber, wattle, and daub. Thatched roofs required annual maintenance, creating communal work parties where neighbours helped each other prepare for winter. Houses often shared walls for warmth, creating close-knit neighbourhood units where privacy was virtually unknown. The role of women in medieval Scottish society extended far beyond domestic duties. They managed household economies, including brewing ale, often the only safe drinking option, when water sources were contaminated. Women served as healers, using traditional knowledge passed through generations. In the absence of men during conflicts, women took charge of agricultural work and defensive preparations. Some women gained significant political influence through strategic marriages and property ownership. Children in medieval Scotland entered adult responsibilities early. By age 7, most were contributing to household labour. Boys learned trades through apprenticeships, while girls mastered textile production and food preparation. Education remained limited to ecclesiastical schools for potential clergy and noble children. Most learning occurred through oral tradition and practical demonstration rather than formal instruction. The concept of childhood as a protected period didn't exist. Young people faced the same harsh realities as adults: disease, violence, and scarcity. Coming-of-age rituals marked transitions to adult status, often involving demonstrations of skill or endurance. Marriage ages varied by social class, with noble families arranging unions for political advantage, while common people married later, when they could establish independent households. Trade networks in medieval Scotland connected remote communities to wider European markets. Wool became Scotland's primary export, with monasteries operating large sheep farms. Fish, particularly herring and salmon, provided another valuable commodity. Imports included wine, spices, and manufactured goods that local craftsmen couldn't produce. Merchants faced dangerous journeys over difficult terrain, making successful traders wealthy and influential. The development of burghs transformed Scottish society. These trading towns received special privileges from the Crown, including the right to hold markets and elect their own officials. Burgesses, town citizens with full rights, formed exclusive groups that controlled local commerce. Craft guilds regulated production quality and prices while providing social support for members. Urban centres became melting pots where different cultures and languages intersected. Medieval Scottish law combined various traditions. Celtic Brehon law emphasised compensation rather than punishment. Norse influences in northern regions introduced different legal concepts. Norman feudal law gradually spread from the south. This legal pluralism meant that identical crimes might receive different punishments depending on location and the accused's social status. Justice administration often occurred at the local level. Sheriff courts handled most criminal cases, while baron courts dealt with estate matters. The king's justice remained distant for most Scots, who relied on customary law interpreted by local leaders. Blood feuds persisted as an alternative justice system when official channels failed to provide satisfaction. The monetary system in medieval Scotland was complex and often unreliable. Multiple currencies circulated simultaneously, including English, French, and Scottish coins of varying quality. Barter remained common in rural areas where coined money was scarce. Debt relationships created social bonds that extended beyond simple economic transactions. Credit networks based on personal reputation allowed commerce to function despite currency shortages. Taxation took various forms beyond monetary payment. Labour service required peasants to work their lord's lands for specified periods. Military service obligated men to fight when summoned. Renders in kind, grain, livestock, or craft product formed significant portions of tax obligations. These varied demands created complex webs of obligation that structured social relationships. The medieval Scottish military system relied on personal service rather than professional armies. The host, a general levy of able-bodied men, could be summoned for defensive wars. Highland warriors developed distinctive fighting styles using terrain advantages. Lowland forces adopted continental military innovations more readily. Castles served as power projection platforms rather than purely defensive structures, controlling surrounding territories through threat of force. Weapon production became specialized crafts. Blacksmiths who could forge quality weapons earned high status. The Scottish sword developed unique characteristics suited to local fighting styles. Armour remained expensive, limiting full protection to wealthy warriors. Most fighters relied on leather protection and agility rather than heavy armour. Maritime Scotland developed differently from inland regions. Coastal communities built distinctive vessel types adapted to local conditions. The Berlin, a Highland galley, could navigate both rough seas and shallow rivers. Fishing communities developed sophisticated knowledge of tidal patterns and seasonal fish movements. Pirates and legitimate traders often overlapped, with the same vessels serving both purposes depending on opportunities. Island communities maintained semi-autonomous status through geographic isolation. The Hebrides developed a unique cultural blend of Norse and Celtic influences. Orkney and Shetland remained under Norwegian control until 1472, creating different developmental trajectories. Island lords commanded fleets that could challenge royal authority, making naval power essential for controlling Scotland. Religious architecture in medieval Scotland reflected both devotion and political power. Abbey construction required enormous resources, demonstrating patrons' wealth and piety. Architectural styles evolved from Romanesque solidity to Gothic verticality. Scottish masons developed distinctive features, including crown spires that became architectural signatures. Religious buildings served multiple functions: worship spaces, defensive structures, and economic centres. Monastic orders brought agricultural innovations to Scotland. Cistercians introduced improved sheep breeding techniques. Augustinians established hospitals and schools. Franciscans and Dominicans provided urban ministry. These religious communities created international networks that transmitted knowledge and culture across Europe. Monasteries became Scotland's first libraries, preserving manuscripts and producing new texts. Pilgrimage routes crisscrossed medieval Scotland. St Andrews attracted pilgrims from across Europe. Local shrines provided more accessible destinations for common people. Pilgrimage combined religious devotion with economic opportunity, as settlements along routes prospered from providing services. The pilgrimage experience created shared cultural references that united diverse populations. The Scottish Church developed distinctive characteristics. Married priests continued longer than in other European regions. Celtic Christian traditions persisted alongside Roman practices. The church calendar structured agricultural and social life, with feast days providing respite from labour. Parish churches became community centres where secular and sacred activities intermingled. Medieval Scottish medicine blended empirical observation with supernatural beliefs. Physicians trained in European universities served the elite, while folk healers treated common people. Herbal remedies formed the basis of most treatments. Surgical procedures remained primitive and dangerous. Mental illness was poorly understood, often attributed to demonic possession or divine punishment. Disease spread rapidly in medieval Scotland's crowded, unsanitary conditions. Leprosy created social outcasts relegated to isolated colonies. Tuberculosis ravaged urban populations. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making people vulnerable to infections. Child mortality rates meant parents expected to lose multiple children. These health challenges shaped demographic patterns and social structures. The medieval Scottish calendar differed from modern conceptions. The year began on March 25th, Lady Day, rather than January 1st. Seasonal celebrations marked agricultural transitions. Beltane welcomed summer while Samhain acknowledged winter's approach. These festivals combined Christian and pre-Christian elements, creating unique Scottish traditions. Time measurement relied on natural phenomena, sunrise, sunset, and seasonal changes, rather than mechanical clocks. Communication in medieval Scotland faced significant challenges. Most people never travelled beyond their immediate vicinity. News spread slowly through travelling merchants, pilgrims, and royal messengers. Literacy remained limited to clergy and some nobles. Oral culture dominated, with storytellers preserving history and entertainment. Messages between distant locations could take weeks or months, creating information asymmetries that shaped political and economic decisions. The role of animals in medieval Scottish society extended beyond food production. Horses provided transportation and military advantage, but required extensive resources to maintain. Oxen powered agricultural work. Dogs served multiple functions: hunting, herding, and protection. Cats controlled rodent populations that threatened grain stores. The relationship between humans and animals was practical rather than sentimental, yet animals were valued for their contributions to survival. Forest resources shaped medieval Scottish life. Timber provided building materials and fuel. Forest products included pitch for waterproofing, bark for tanning leather, and nuts for food. Hunting rights in forests became symbols of social status. Deforestation for agriculture and shipbuilding began changing Scottish landscapes. Forest law created conflicts between common use rights and aristocratic privileges. Mining operations in medieval Scotland were small-scale but significant. Silver mines provided currency material. Iron ore supported tool and weapon production. Coal mining began in certain regions, though wood remained the primary fuel. Salt production from seawater became important for food preservation. These extractive industries created specialized communities with unique cultures and challenges. The textile industry formed a crucial part of medieval Scotland's economy. Wool processing required multiple stages: shearing, cleaning, spinning, weaving, and finishing. Each stage might involve different workers, creating complex production chains. Linen production from flax provided another textile option. Dyeing used local plants and imported materials to create coloured fabrics. Quality control and standardization became important for maintaining market reputation. Leatherworking was essential for medieval Scottish society. Tanners processed animal hides into usable leather, despite the process creating terrible smells that relegated tanneries to settlement outskirts. Leather provided clothing, footwear, armour, and storage containers. Skilled leatherworkers created decorated items that served as status symbols. The leather trade connected pastoral and urban economies. Metalworking beyond weapons included everyday items. Blacksmiths produced agricultural tools, household implements, and construction hardware. Precious metal workers created jewellery and religious objects. Bronze casting produced bells and decorative items. These crafts required specialised knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship systems. Successful metalworkers could achieve considerable wealth and social status. Brewing and distilling began developing in medieval Scotland. Ale production was primarily a domestic activity, with most households brewing their own. Commercial brewing emerged in towns where specialised brewers served multiple customers. Early whiskey production occurred in monasteries for medicinal purposes. These alcoholic beverages provided safer alternatives to potentially contaminated water, while also serving social and ritual functions. Food preparation techniques in medieval Scotland maximised limited resources. Pottage, a thick soup of grains and vegetables, formed the dietary staple. Bread quality varied by social class, with white bread reserved for elites while others ate dense, dark loaves. Preservation techniques included salting, smoking, pickling, and drying. Cooking methods were limited to boiling, roasting, and baking, requiring skill to create variety from simple techniques. Feast culture in medieval Scotland reinforced social hierarchies. Noble feasts displayed wealth through elaborate dishes and entertainment. Guild feasts strengthened professional bonds. Wedding feasts could bankrupt families trying to maintain social standing. Funeral feasts honoured the deceased while redistributing their wealth. These gatherings served political, economic, and social functions beyond simple nutrition. Games and entertainment provided relief from harsh daily life. Board games like chess and backgammon arrived from the continent. Dice games were popular despite religious condemnation of gambling. Physical contests included wrestling, archery, and primitive football. Music and dance varied by region and social class. Seasonal celebrations featured distinctive entertainments that mark the calendar year. Storytelling traditions preserved history and culture. Professional storytellers, called seanachis, memorized genealogies and clan histories. Heroic tales inspired warrior culture. Cautionary tales taught moral lessons. Ghost stories reflected beliefs about death and the afterlife. This oral literature shaped Scottish identity before widespread literacy. Education in medieval Scotland centred on religious institutions. Cathedral schools trained clergy in Latin, theology, and church administration. Some monasteries maintained scriptoriums where manuscripts were copied. Noble children might receive private tutoring in martial arts, languages, and estate management. Craft education occurred through apprenticeships that could last 7 years. Most Scots remained illiterate, relying on memory and oral instruction. The development of Scottish universities began in the medieval period. St Andrews University, founded in 1413, became Scotland's first university. Glasgow University followed in 1451. These institutions initially focused on training clergy but gradually expanded their curricula. University education remained exclusive to males from privileged backgrounds. Academic life involved intense study, religious observation, and strict disciplinary codes. Medieval Scottish art reflected both religious devotion and secular power. Illuminated manuscripts demonstrated artistic skill and religious dedication. Stone carving decorated churches and castles with symbolic imagery. Metalwork produced elaborate Celtic designs on weapons and jewellery. Textile arts created tapestries that told stories and displayed wealth. These artistic traditions combined indigenous styles with continental influences. Music in medieval Scotland served various functions. Liturgical music accompanied religious services. Bagpipes, despite later associations, were just one of many instruments. Harps held special cultural significance, with skilled harpers enjoying high status. Work songs coordinated group labour. Battle music inspired warriors and intimidated enemies. Musical traditions varied significantly between Gaelic and Scots-speaking regions. The concept of privacy barely existed in medieval Scotland. Most activities occurred in communal spaces. Sleeping arrangements often involved multiple people sharing beds. Personal possessions were limited and often shared. Privacy was a luxury available only to the very wealthy. This constant proximity created different concepts of individual identity and personal space. Clothing in medieval Scotland indicated social status, occupation, and regional origin. Wool dominated, with quality varying by price. Linen undergarments were worn by those who could afford them. Leather provided durable outerwear. Dyes were expensive, making coloured clothing a status symbol. Highland dress began developing distinctive characteristics. Clothing was valuable property, often mentioned specifically in wills. Personal hygiene in medieval Scotland faced significant challenges. Bathing was infrequent due to fuel costs for heating water. Soap was a luxury item. Teeth cleaning relied on rough cloths and herbs. Parasites like lice and fleas were common across all social classes. Perfumes and herbs masked body odours. These hygiene limitations contributed to disease transmission. Timekeeping in medieval Scotland relied on natural and religious rhythms. Church bells marked prayer times that structured daily activities. Sundials provided time measurement on clear days, candles marked time during darkness, seasonal changes determined agricultural activities. This temporal framework differed fundamentally from modern clock-based time. Travel in medieval Scotland was difficult and dangerous. Roads were often mere tracks that became impassable in bad weather. Bridges were rare, making river crossings hazardous. Hospitality customs required offering shelter to travellers. Pilgrim routes were slightly better maintained. Most people travelled on foot, with horses reserved for the wealthy. Journey times were unpredictable, depending on weather and safety conditions. The concept of nationality in medieval Scotland was fluid. Regional identities often superseded national ones. Language differences created cultural boundaries. Norman French influences competed with Gaelic traditions. English cultural penetration increased over time. These multiple identities created complex loyalty patterns that influenced political developments. Property rights in medieval Scotland involved overlapping claims. Land ownership might be separated from use rights. Common lands provided resources for entire communities. Inheritance customs varied between regions and social classes. Women's property rights were limited but not entirely absent. Property disputes generated much of medieval Scotland's legal activity. The role of fosterage in medieval Scottish society created artificial kinship bonds. Noble children were raised by other families to cement alliances. This practice created loyalty networks that crossed clan boundaries. Foster relationships were considered as strong as blood ties. Fosterage also provided education and social connections. This system distributed child-rearing responsibilities while strengthening political relationships. Marriage customs in medieval Scotland varied significantly. Handfasting allowed temporary unions that could be formalised or dissolved. Church efforts to control marriage faced resistance from traditional practices. Property considerations often outweighed romantic feelings. Divorce was difficult but not impossible. Marriage alliances shaped political landscapes. Wedding ceremonies combined religious and folk traditions. Death rituals in medieval Scotland reflected complex beliefs about afterlife. Wake customs allowed communities to honour the deceased. Burial locations indicated social status. Grave goods sometimes accompanied the dead despite Christian prohibitions. Prayers for souls in purgatory created economic obligations. Inheritance disputes often began before bodies were cold. Death was a community event requiring collective response. Supernatural beliefs permeated medieval Scottish life. Fairies were blamed for unexplained illnesses and disappearances. Ghosts of the unjustly killed sought vengeance. Witchcraft accusations reflected social tensions. Protective charms and rituals warded off evil. These beliefs influenced daily decisions and social relationships. The Church struggled to suppress or Christianize these persistent folk beliefs. Agricultural innovations slowly transformed medieval Scottish farming. Three-field rotation systems improved soil fertility. New plough designs increased efficiency. Selective breeding improved livestock quality. Drainage projects reclaimed marginal lands. These improvements occurred gradually and unevenly. Agricultural knowledge spread slowly through oral transmission and practical demonstration. The role of credit in medieval Scottish society extended beyond simple loans. Delayed payment arrangements allowed commerce despite currency shortages. Social credit based on reputation enabled transactions. Debt relationships created social bonds and obligations. Default could result in social ostracism. Credit networks revealed trust patterns within communities. Conflict resolution in medieval Scotland included various mechanisms. Formal legal proceedings were one option. Arbitration by respected community members offered another path. Compensation payments could end feuds. Ritualized combat sometimes settled disputes. Exile removed troublesome individuals. These various approaches reflected the pluralistic nature of medieval Scottish society. The development of Scottish national identity was a gradual process. Shared enemies, particularly England, created unity. Common experiences like the Wars of Independence fostered solidarity. Distinctive customs and laws differentiated Scots from others. National saints provided religious focus. Royal symbolism gradually gained meaning. This emerging identity coexisted with strong regional loyalties. Technology transfer in medieval Scotland occurred through various channels. Returning crusaders brought Eastern innovations. Monastic networks transmitted agricultural improvements. Trading connections introduced new crafts. Intermarriage spread techniques between regions. War brought military innovations. These transfers were slow and uneven, with some regions adopting innovations centuries after others. The role of ceremony in medieval Scottish life extended beyond religious rituals. Homage ceremonies reinforced feudal relationships. Guild ceremonies marked professional advancement. Seasonal ceremonies ensured agricultural success. Royal ceremonies legitimized political power. These ceremonial occasions provided structure and meaning to social life while reinforcing hierarchies. Environmental changes affected medieval Scottish society. Climate variations influenced agricultural productivity. Deforestation changed landscapes and economies. Soil exhaustion forced agricultural adaptation. Wildlife depletion affected hunting culture. These environmental factors shaped settlement patterns and economic development. Human activity began significantly altering Scottish ecosystems. The concept of honour in medieval Scotland influenced behaviour across social classes. Personal reputation affected economic opportunities. Family honour required defending against insults. Professional honour maintained craft standards. Military honour glorified combat death. This honour culture created both social cohesion and violent conflict. Honour obligations could override practical considerations. Demographic patterns in medieval Scotland reflected harsh living conditions. High infant mortality meant large families were necessary for survival. Life expectancy remained low across all social classes. Population density varied dramatically between regions. Urban areas attracted rural migrants despite higher mortality rates. Demographic crises from famines and diseases periodically reset population levels. The role of alcohol in medieval Scottish society was complex. Ale provided nutrition and hydration. Wine demonstrated wealth and continental connections. Mead linked to ancient traditions. Distilled spirits began appearing for medicinal purposes. Alcohol facilitated social bonding and business negotiations. Drunkenness was both celebrated and condemned depending on context. Craft specialization in medieval Scotland created economic niches. Specialized skills commanded premium prices. Craft secrets were closely guarded within families. Innovation was slow but significant over time. Craft products served as regional identifiers. Successful craftsmen could achieve social mobility. Specialization indicated economic development in settlements. The role of gossip and reputation in medieval Scottish communities was crucial. Information networks relied on oral transmission. Reputation affected marriage prospects and business opportunities. Gossip enforced social norms. Character witnesses were essential in legal proceedings. Social control operated through reputation management. Privacy's absence made reputation management critical. Seasonal labour patterns structured medieval Scottish life. Spring required planting and lambing. Summer demanded haymaking and maintenance. Autumn brought harvest and preservation work. Winter allowed craft production and repair work. These patterns created predictable rhythms. Seasonal labour mobility moved workers between regions. Weather variations could disrupt established patterns catastrophically. The concept of measurement in medieval Scotland lacked standardisation. Distance measurements varied between regions. Weight and volume measures differed between markets. Time measurements were imprecise. Land measurements reflected local customs. This lack of standardisation complicated trade and taxation. Gradual standardisation indicated growing central authority. Waste management in medieval Scotland created health challenges. Human waste accumulated in settlements. Animal waste provided fertiliser but also disease vectors. Garbage disposal was haphazard. Water sources became contaminated. These sanitation problems contributed to disease spread. Urban areas faced particular challenges managing waste from concentrated populations. The role of fire in medieval Scottish life was fundamental. Heating required constant fuel gathering. Cooking fires were rarely extinguished. Fire provided light during long winters. Accidental fires could destroy entire settlements. Fire management required community cooperation. The hearth became symbolic of home and family. Material culture in medieval Scotland reflected available resources and social status. Wooden items dominated due to timber availability. Metal objects were valuable and carefully maintained. Ceramic production was limited compared to other European regions. Glass remained a luxury import. Textile production created most household goods. Material possessions were few, but significant. The development of coinage in medieval Scotland reflected political and economic evolution. Early coins imitated English designs. Debasement during crises reduced coin value. Foreign coins circulated alongside domestic currency. Counterfeiting threatened economic stability. Coin designs conveyed political messages. Monetary policy became a tool of royal authority. Navigation techniques in medieval Scotland combined practical knowledge and superstition. Coastal sailing relied on landmark recognition. Weather prediction used natural signs. Tidal knowledge was essential for coastal communities. Star navigation was known but limited. Maritime knowledge was transmitted orally through generations. Navigation errors could be fatal in Scotland's dangerous waters. The role of servants in medieval Scottish households varied by employer status. Noble households employed numerous specialised servants. Urban households might have one or two servants. Rural servants often lived as family members. Service provided social mobility opportunities. Servant-employer relationships involved complex obligations. Good servants were valuable and sometimes mentioned in wills. Food distribution systems in medieval Scotland reflected social hierarchies. Markets operated under strict regulations. Forestalling and regrating were prohibited to prevent speculation. Charitable food distribution occurred during crises. Feast distributions reinforced social bonds. Food gifts carried symbolic meaning. Access to food varieties indicated social status. The concept of youth in medieval Scotland differed from modern ideas. Young people assumed adult responsibilities early. Youth groups sometimes challenged authority. Marriage marked full adult status. Young men might spend years as warriors before settling. Young women faced pressure for advantageous marriages. Youth was brief and often turbulent. Building techniques in medieval Scotland evolved slowly. Stone construction required specialised skills. Timber framing dominated vernacular architecture. Thatching techniques varied regionally. Lime mortar production was technically demanding. Construction projects required community cooperation. Building materials indicated wealth and status. The role of borders in medieval Scotland was complex. National borders remained fluid and contested. Regional boundaries were marked by natural features. Property boundaries required constant maintenance. March law governed border regions. Border communities developed unique cultures. Boundaries both separated and connected communities. Religious reform movements periodically challenged medieval Scottish church practices. Reformers criticised clerical corruption. Monastic reforms sought return to original rules. Popular religious movements threatened church authority. Reform attempts often failed against entrenched interests. These movements presaged later Protestant Reformation. Religious diversity existed despite official uniformity. The development of legal procedures in medieval Scotland showed growing sophistication. Written documentation gradually supplemented oral testimony. Jury systems began developing. Legal professionals emerged in towns. Precedent began influencing decisions. Appeals procedures developed slowly. Legal complexity reflected social development. Trade regulation in medieval Scotland balanced various interests. Royal privileges granted monopolies. Guild regulations controlled quality. Market regulations prevented fraud. Price controls attempted to ensure affordability. Customs duties funded royal government. These regulations created structured but inflexible economies. The role of prophecy in medieval Scottish culture influenced political decisions. Prophetic traditions claimed ancient origins. Political prophecies justified rebellions. Religious prophecies shaped expectations. Prophecies provided hope during crises. Skeptics and believers coexisted. Prophecy interpretation was contested and political. Environmental knowledge in medieval Scotland was extensive but localised. Weather patterns were closely observed. Seasonal variations guided activities. Plant and animal behaviours indicated changes. Local knowledge was highly specific. This knowledge was practical rather than theoretical. Environmental understanding was essential for survival. The concept of mental illness in medieval Scotland was poorly understood. Madness was attributed to various causes. Treatment ranged from restraint to pilgrimage. Mad individuals might be seen as holy or cursed. Families bore responsibility for mentally ill members. Institutional care was virtually non-existent. Mental illness stigmatized entire families. Diplomatic practices in medieval Scotland developed sophistication. Marriage negotiations required delicate handling. Trade agreements balanced competing interests. Military alliances shifted frequently. Diplomatic immunity was sometimes respected. Language barriers complicated negotiations. Diplomatic failures could trigger wars. The role of exile in medieval Scottish society was significant. Political exiles sought foreign support. Criminal exiles lost property and protection. Voluntary exile avoided worse punishments. Exile communities maintained Scottish identities abroad. Return from exile was politically dangerous. Exile shaped political and cultural development. Technological adaptation in medieval Scotland was selective. Some innovations were eagerly adopted. Others were rejected for cultural reasons. Adaptation speed varied between regions. Cost often prevented adoption. Traditional methods persisted alongside innovations. Technological conservatism had rational bases. The concept of community in medieval Scotland extended beyond geography. Kinship created primary communities. Occupational communities crossed regional boundaries. Religious communities united diverse populations. Language communities maintained distinct identities. Communities provided security and identity. Community membership involved complex obligations. Record-keeping in medieval Scotland gradually improved. Monastic records preserved historical information. Royal records documented government activities. Burr records tracked commercial transactions. Estate records managed agricultural production. Most records were lost to time. Surviving records provide incomplete pictures. The role of vengeance in medieval Scottish culture was central. Blood feuds could last generations. Vengeance was considered honourable. Compensation sometimes replaced vengeance. Christian forgiveness competed with vengeance culture. Vengeance cycles destroyed entire families. Cultural change slowly reduced vengeance violence. Architectural symbolism in medieval Scotland conveyed messages. Castle designs projected military power. Church architecture inspired religious awe. Tower houses demonstrated family status. Decorative elements contained meaning. Architecture required literate interpretation. Buildings were texts for those who could read them. The development of commerce in medieval Scotland faced numerous obstacles. Poor infrastructure hindered trade. Currency problems complicated transactions. Political instability discouraged investment. Limited markets restricted growth. International competition was fierce. Commercial development was slow and uneven. Social mobility in medieval Scotland was limited but possible. Military service provided advancement opportunities. Church careers offered education and influence. Successful trade could create wealth. Marriage could change social position. Talent sometimes overcame birth limitations. Most people remained in birth status. The role of rumour in medieval Scottish society was powerful. Rumours travelled faster than official news. Political rumours influenced loyalties. Economic rumours affected markets. Social rumours destroyed reputations. Rumour management was politically important. Truth and rumour were often indistinguishable. Cultural transmission in medieval Scotland occurred through various mechanisms. Oral traditions preserved knowledge. Apprenticeships transmitted skills. Marriages spread customs between regions. Travel exposed people to new ideas. Cultural change was slow but continuous. Regional variations persisted despite homogenizing forces. The concept of loyalty in medieval Scotland was multi-layered. Personal loyalty to lords was expected. Clan loyalty might conflict with royal loyalty. Religious loyalty competed with secular loyalties. Loyalty conflicts created political crises. Loyalty oaths were frequently broken. Multiple loyalties characterized most people's lives. Resource scarcity in medieval Scotland shaped social structures. Competition for limited resources created conflict. Sharing mechanisms developed within communities. Hoarding was both rational and condemned. Scarcity influenced political decisions. Abundance was temporary and localized. Scarcity was the normal condition. The role of ritual in medieval Scottish daily life provided structure. Morning prayers began days. Meal rituals reinforced hierarchies. Work rituals ensured safety and success. Evening rituals ended daily cycles. Seasonal rituals marked time passage. Rituals provided psychological comfort in an uncertain world. Knowledge preservation in medieval Scotland faced challenges. Oral traditions were vulnerable to disruption. Written records required expensive materials. Knowledge was often secretive and restricted. Wars and disasters destroyed knowledge repositories. Knowledge transmission was uncertain. Much knowledge was permanently lost. The development of regional identities within medieval Scotland created internal diversity. Highland culture differed from lowland. Island communities developed unique characteristics. Border regions had distinctive features. Urban areas created new identities. Regional identities persisted alongside national identity. Scotland was never culturally uniform. Economic inequality in medieval Scotland was extreme. Wealth concentration increased over time. Poverty was widespread and severe. Middle groups were small and vulnerable. Economic mobility was very limited. Inequality was justified through various ideologies. Economic structures reinforced social hierarchies. The role of charity in medieval Scottish society was complex. Religious charity was obligatory. Secular charity enhanced reputation. Charity recipients faced stigma. Charitable institutions developed slowly. Charity was insufficient for poverty levels. Charity reinforced rather than challenged inequality. Cultural contact in medieval Scotland brought changes. Scandinavian influences persisted in northern regions. French culture arrived with Norman influences. English culture increasingly penetrated Scotland. Continental connections brought new ideas. Cultural contact created hybrid forms. Indigenous culture adapted rather than disappeared. The concept of justice in medieval Scotland evolved gradually. Retributive justice dominated early period. Compensatory justice offered alternatives. Royal justice slowly expanded reach. Local justice remained important. Justice was often delayed or denied. Multiple justice systems created confusion. Population movement within medieval Scotland was constant. Rural to urban migration occurred regularly. Seasonal movements followed work. Displacement from conflicts created refugees. Colonization efforts moved populations. Voluntary migration sought opportunities. Population movement shaped regional development. The role of memory in medieval Scottish society was crucial. Collective memory preserved group identity. Legal memory established precedents. Genealogical memory determined inheritance. Traumatic memories influenced behavior. Memory was selective and constructed. Memory contested between different groups. Natural disasters impacted medieval Scottish society severely. Harsh winters caused starvation. Floods destroyed crops and settlements. Storms wrecked fishing fleets. Livestock diseases devastated herds. Human responses were limited. Disasters were interpreted religiously. The development of craftsmanship in medieval Scotland showed regional specialization. Different areas developed distinctive products. Craft techniques were closely guarded. Innovation occurred slowly within traditions. Craft products served as cultural markers. Successful craftsmen gained social respect. Craftsmanship represented cultural achievement. Power distribution in medieval Scotland was complex. Royal power was often theoretical. Regional magnates exercised real control. Church power competed with secular authority. Economic power didn't always match political power. Power was constantly negotiated. Multiple power centres created instability. The role of violence in medieval Scottish society was pervasive. Violence resolved disputes. Violence demonstrated masculinity. Violence maintained social order. Violence was ritualized and regulated. Violence had acceptable and unacceptable forms. Violence shaped social relationships. Cultural production in medieval Scotland reflected patronage patterns. Elite patronage supported arts. Church patronage created religious art. Royal patronage projected power. Popular culture received no patronage. Cultural production was limited but significant. Surviving culture represents elite tastes. The concept of time in medieval Scotland differed from modern perceptions. Cyclical time dominated agricultural life. Linear time existed in Christian theology. Precise time measurement was impossible. Time passage marked by natural events. Past, present, and future intersected differently. Time consciousness was fundamentally different. Communication networks in medieval Scotland were informal but effective. Kinship networks transmitted information. Trade networks carried news. Religious networks connected regions. Information travelled slowly but surely. Network membership provided advantages. Networks overlapped and competed. The role of tradition in medieval Scottish society was conservative. Tradition justified current practices. Innovation was viewed suspiciously. Traditional knowledge had practical value. Traditions evolved despite claims of antiquity. Tradition and change coexisted tensely. Tradition provided stability in uncertain times. Economic diversity in medieval Scotland was limited. Most people engaged in agriculture. Specialisation was rare outside towns. Economic activities were seasonal. Multiple occupations were common. Economic diversity increased slowly. Regional economies showed variations. The development of authority in medieval Scotland was contested. Traditional authority competed with new forms. Authority required constant reinforcement. Authority was performed through rituals. Challenges to authority were frequent. Authority was negotiated rather than absolute. Multiple authorities created confusion. Social control mechanisms in medieval Scotland were varied. Formal law was one mechanism. Social pressure was more common. Economic dependence ensured compliance. Religious sanctions threatened disobedience. Violence enforced social order. Social control was imperfect but effective. The role of fear in medieval Scottish life was omnipresent. Fear of violence was rational. Fear of starvation was seasonal. Fear of disease was constant. Fear of damnation influenced behaviour. Fear of social ostracism ensured conformity. Fear shaped daily decisions. Cultural resilience in medieval Scotland was remarkable. Culture survived political upheavals. Local cultures resisted homogenization. Oral culture preserved traditions. Material culture adapted to circumstances. Cultural identity provided psychological support. Culture was dynamic despite conservative claims. The concept of ownership in medieval Scotland was complex. Land ownership involved multiple claims. Movable property was more clearly owned. Common resources created conflicts. Ownership rights were gendered. Inheritance rules varied regionally. Ownership disputes were common. Knowledge hierarchies in medieval Scotland reflected social structures. Elite knowledge was restricted. Practical knowledge was widespread. Religious knowledge claimed superiority. Female knowledge was marginalized. Secret knowledge provided power. Knowledge access marked social boundaries. The development of resistance in medieval Scotland took various forms. Political resistance challenged authority. Cultural resistance preserved identities. Economic resistance included work slowdowns. Religious resistance questioned church power. Resistance was dangerous but persistent. Resistance shaped historical development. Environmental adaptation in medieval Scotland showed ingenuity. Building techniques suited climate. Clothing styles reflected weather. Agricultural practices adapted to conditions. Seasonal activities followed environmental rhythms. Adaptation was continuous and creative. Environmental pressures shaped culture. The role of contingency in medieval Scottish history was significant. Individual decisions had major consequences. Weather events changed historical trajectories. Diseases altered demographic patterns. Chance encounters influenced politics. History was not predetermined. Contingency makes counterfactuals interesting. Social reproduction in medieval Scotland maintained hierarchies. Elite families preserved advantages. Craft families transmitted skills. Peasant families reproduced poverty. Social structures were self-reinforcing. Change was possible but difficult. Reproduction wasn't always successful. The concept of the sacred in medieval Scotland extended beyond religion. Sacred spaces required special behaviour. Sacred times suspended normal rules. Sacred objects possessed power. Sacred knowledge was restricted. Sacred and profane intersected complexly. Sacrilege was severely punished. Economic strategies in medieval Scotland showed creativity. Diversification reduced risk. Cooperation provided mutual support. Hoarding prepared for scarcity. Credit extended economic possibilities. Strategies varied by circumstances. Success required adaptability. The development of expertise in medieval Scotland was gradual and specialised. Master craftsmen spent decades perfecting techniques. Medical practitioners combined empirical observation with traditional beliefs. Legal experts memorized vast bodies of customary law. Agricultural specialists understood subtle soil variations. Military tacticians studied terrain and weather patterns. This expertise was often hereditary, passed from parent to child through years of observation and practice. Settlement patterns in medieval Scotland revealed adaptation to landscape and danger. Villages clustered around defensive positions. Hilltops, river bends, or beside protective forests. Individual farms in dangerous border regions included defensive towers. Coastal settlements balanced access to fishing grounds with protection from raiders. Urban settlements grew around castles, abbeys, or natural harbours. Each settlement type developed distinctive social structures and economic patterns. The role of intermediaries in medieval Scottish society was crucial. Merchants connected producers with consumers across dangerous distances. Marriage brokers negotiated between families. Translators facilitated communication across language barriers. Priests mediated between human and divine. Lawyers interpreted between custom and written law. These intermediaries gained power through their connecting roles, often becoming wealthy despite producing nothing tangible themselves. Seasonal festivals in medieval Scotland blended agricultural necessity with spiritual meaning. Lammas celebrated the grain harvest while acknowledging dependence on divine favour. Michaelmas marked the accounting year's end and hiring fairs for servants. Martinmas brought the slaughter of livestock that couldn't be fed through winter. These festivals provided structure to the year while allowing temporary relaxation of social constraints through feasting and celebration. The concept of territory in medieval Scotland involved overlapping claims and uses. Hunting rights might belong to one lord while grazing rights belonged to communities. Seasonal usage patterns meant the same land served different purposes throughout the year. Boundaries were often marked by natural features rather than surveyed lines. Territorial disputes arose from these ambiguous arrangements, sometimes persisting for centuries. Water management in medieval Scotland required community cooperation. Mills needed regulated water flow, creating disputes over river usage. Drainage projects required collective labour and maintenance. Fishing rights were carefully allocated and defended. Wells and springs were communally maintained but individually accessed. Water pollution from tanning and dyeing created conflicts between users. Control over water resources provided significant economic and political power. The development of credit instruments in medieval Scotland showed financial sophistication. Letters of obligation documented debts formally. Wadsets provided land security for loans. Bills of exchange facilitated long-distance trade. Tally sticks recorded transactions for illiterate parties. Credit relationships created social bonds beyond economic transactions. Default consequences range from property loss to social ostracism. Cultural hybridity in medieval Scotland resulted from multiple influences. Norse Gaelic culture dominated the Western Islands. Anglo-Norman culture influenced the lowlands. Continental connections brought French and Flemish elements. Indigenous traditions adapted and persisted. This mixing created distinctive Scottish variations of broader European patterns. Cultural purity was a myth even in medieval times. The role of shame in medieval Scottish society enforced behavioural norms. Public humiliation punished minor offences. Sexual misconduct brought communal shaming. Cowardice in battle destroyed male reputation permanently. Debt default brought shame to entire families. Shame was often more feared than physical punishment. Recovery from shame required extraordinary efforts or exile. Transportation of goods in medieval Scotland faced enormous challenges. Pack horses navigated narrow mountain paths. Sledges moved goods where wheels couldn't function. Coastal shipping avoided dangerous inland routes. River transport was limited by rapids and seasonal variations. Transport costs often exceeded production costs. Geography profoundly influenced economic development patterns. The concept of news in medieval Scotland differed from modern understanding. Information travelled with people, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers. Official proclamations were read at market crosses. Rumours and facts intermingled indistinguishably. News arrived in waves as travellers reached settlements. Verification was nearly impossible. Communities might learn of major events months or years late. Fuel acquisition in medieval Scotland consumed enormous labour. Peat cutting required summer work for winter warmth. Wood gathering depleted nearby forests quickly. Coal mining began in accessible deposits. Dried animal dung supplemented other fuels. Fuel scarcity influenced settlement patterns. Winter survival depended on adequate fuel supplies. The development of navigation aids in medieval Scotland improved gradually. Cairns marked safe paths through treacherous terrain. Coastal beacons warned of dangers or invasions. Crossmarked stones indicated boundaries and meeting places. Oral directions relied on landscape features rather than distances. Getting lost could be fatal in wilderness areas. Local knowledge was invaluable for safe travel. Craft mysteries in medieval Scotland protected trade secrets. Apprentices swore oaths not to reveal techniques. Guild ceremonies initiated members into craft knowledge. Innovation within crafts was closely guarded. Industrial espionage existed even then. Mystery plays performed by crafts had double meanings. Knowledge monopolies provided economic advantages. The role of oaths in medieval Scottish society was fundamental. Oaths sealed agreements in largely illiterate society. Breaking oaths brought divine punishment fears. Oath helpers supported legal testimony. Conflicting oaths created moral dilemmas. Oath ceremonies involved sacred objects. Trust in oaths enabled complex transactions. Demographic recovery after crises in medieval Scotland followed patterns. Plagues created temporary land abundance. Wars disrupted gender balances. Famines delayed marriages and births. Recovery took generations. Immigration sometimes supplemented natural increase. Population levels fluctuated dramatically over centuries. The concept of pollution in medieval Scotland encompassed physical and spiritual dimensions. Certain activities created ritual pollution. Industrial processes polluted water sources. Death pollution required purification. Moral pollution threatened communities. Pollution boundaries reinforced social divisions. Purification rituals restored balance. Economic specialization by region in medieval Scotland developed naturally. Highland areas specialized in cattle raising. Lowland regions produced grain. Coastal communities focused on fishing. Mining districts developed where minerals existed. Specialization created interdependence and trade. Regional economies were vulnerable to specialized disasters. The development of law codes in medieval Scotland showed evolution from custom to statute. Oral law gradually became written. Royal legislation supplemented local custom. Canon law influenced secular law. Legal pluralism created jurisdictional conflicts. Codification attempts were partially successful. Law remained complex and contradictory. Power projection in medieval Scotland required symbolic display. Castle architecture intimidated subjects and rivals. Ceremonial processions demonstrated authority. Hospitality displays showed wealth and power. Heraldry communicated lineage and alliances. Punishment spectacles reinforced authority. Power required constant performance. The role of contingent labour in medieval Scotland was significant. Harvest required additional workers. Construction projects drew temporary labourers. Military campaigns needed short-term soldiers. Seasonal industries employed cyclical workers. Contingent workers were vulnerable but mobile. Labour mobility was higher than often assumed. Cultural persistence in medieval Scotland despite pressures showed remarkable strength. Gaelic culture survived political marginalisation. Folk beliefs persisted despite church opposition. Local customs resisted standardisation attempts. Oral traditions maintained alternative histories. Material culture preserved identity markers. Persistence required active maintenance efforts. The concept of improvement in medieval Scotland emerged slowly. Agricultural improvements were gradually adopted. Building techniques evolved incrementally. Tool designs showed refinement over time. Breeding programs improved livestock. Improvement was often resisted as dangerous innovation. Change agents faced suspicion and opposition. Resource conflicts in medieval Scotland were endemic. Grazing rights disputes triggered feuds. Fishing grounds were contested violently. Timber resources caused conflicts. Mining rights were valuable and disputed. Water resources created ongoing tensions. Conflicts reflected resource scarcity. The development of administrative capacity in medieval Scotland was gradual. Record-keeping improved slowly. Tax collection became more systematic. Justice administration expanded territorially. Royal officers increased in number. Administrative reach remained limited. Central authority was aspirational more than actual. Social boundaries in medieval Scotland were maintained through various mechanisms. Sumptuary laws regulated clothing by class. Marriage restrictions prevented social mixing. Occupational limitations reinforced hierarchies. Spatial segregation separated groups. Language differences marked boundaries. Boundaries were permeable but significant. The role of contingency planning in medieval Scotland was limited but important. Grain storage prepared for famine. Castle provisioning anticipated sieges. Seasonal preparations followed established patterns. Alliance systems provided security. Planning horizons were short. Survival required flexibility more than planning. Knowledge contestation in medieval Scotland occurred across domains. Medical knowledge was disputed between traditions. Legal interpretations conflicted regularly. Religious knowledge faced heretical challenges. Agricultural knowledge varied locally. Authoritative knowledge was always questioned. Contestation drove slow change. The concept of boundaries in medieval Scotland was fluid and contested. Property boundaries shifted with power. Jurisdictional boundaries overlapped confusingly. Cultural boundaries were crossed regularly. Social boundaries were enforced but permeable. Political boundaries changed frequently. Boundary maintenance required constant effort. Economic resilience in medieval Scotland developed through diversification. Multiple income sources reduced risk. Subsistence production provided insurance. Exchange networks created support systems. Storage techniques preserved surpluses. Resilient strategies were learned through experience. Survival required adaptability. The development of symbolic systems in medieval Scotland communicated complex information. Heraldic designs identified lineages. Tartans began developing regional associations. Carved stones marked territories and commemorated events. Badge plants identified clan affiliations. Symbolic literacy was widespread. Symbols carried multiple meanings simultaneously. Power negotiations in medieval Scotland were constant. Marriage negotiations balanced power between families. Treaty negotiations temporarily resolved conflicts. Trade negotiations established economic relationships. Religious negotiations defined jurisdictions. All relationships required ongoing negotiation. Power was processual rather than fixed. The role of displacement in medieval Scottish society was significant. Wars displaced populations regularly. Economic changes forced migration. Legal punishments included banishment. Environmental disasters caused displacement. Displaced populations were vulnerable. Displacement shaped demographic patterns. Cultural innovation in medieval Scotland occurred despite conservative pressures. New musical instruments were adopted. Architectural styles evolved gradually. Literary forms developed distinctively. Technological innovation spread slowly. Innovation faced resistance but occurred. Change was incremental but real. The concept of security in medieval Scotland was multifaceted. Physical security required defensive measures. Economic security needed diverse resources. Social security came from network membership. Spiritual security required religious observance. Security was always temporary and threatened. Insecurity was the normal state. Resource cycles in medieval Scotland structured activity patterns. Agricultural cycles dominated rural life. Building cycles followed seasonal weather. Trading cycles connected to harvests and fairs. Military cycles responded to agricultural patterns. Cycles provided predictability in an uncertain world. Disrupted cycles caused crises. The development of collective action in medieval Scotland showed cooperation capacity. Community harvests required coordination. Defence required collective response. Infrastructure projects needed group effort. Religious activities were communal. Collective action faced freerider problems. Success required strong social bonds. Status negotiations in medieval Scotland were subtle but constant. Seating arrangements at feasts indicated status. Forms of address acknowledged hierarchies. Gift exchanges confirmed relationships. Clothing choices signalled aspirations. Status required constant maintenance. Status anxiety was widespread. The role of mediation in medieval Scottish society prevented conflicts. Neutral parties mediated disputes. Clergy mediated between secular powers. Women mediated between male relatives. Mediation required skill and respect. Failed mediation led to violence. Mediation traditions varied regionally. Environmental constraints in medieval Scotland shaped possibilities. Short growing seasons limited crops. Mountainous terrain restricted movement. Climate variations threatened survival. Soil quality determined settlement. Constraints required creative adaptation. Geography was destiny for many. The concept of reciprocity in medieval Scotland structured relationships. Gift exchange created obligations. Hospitality required reciprocation. Aid expected future return. Reciprocity crossed generations. Non-reciprocation broke social bonds. Reciprocity was calculated but disguised. Knowledge production in medieval Scotland was limited but significant. Monastic scriptoriums produced manuscripts. Oral traditions created literature. Practical experience generated innovation. Observation produced environmental knowledge. Knowledge production was collective. Most knowledge was lost. The development of trust networks in medieval Scotland enabled complex transactions. Kinship provided basic trust. Shared religion created trust bonds. Commercial relationships built trust slowly. Trust enabled credit and trade. Betrayal destroyed trust permanently. Trust was valuable social capital. Political culture in medieval Scotland showed distinctive characteristics. Personal loyalty mattered more than institutional loyalty. Oral agreements were binding. Violence was acceptable political tool. Succession disputes were common. Political culture evolved slowly. Regional variations persisted. The role of performance in medieval Scottish society was pervasive. Authority required public performance. Religious rituals were elaborate performances. Legal proceedings were theatrical. Social status was performed daily. Performance and reality merged. Audience participation was expected. Economic volatility in medieval Scotland created insecurity. Prices fluctuated wildly. Harvests varied dramatically. Trade was frequently disrupted. Currency values changed unpredictably. Volatility required flexible strategies. Stability was rare and temporary. The concept of legitimate authority in medieval Scotland was contested. Royal authority claimed divine sanction. Traditional authority invoked custom. Religious authority cited scripture. Military authority relied on force. Legitimacy required recognition. Multiple authorities competed. Social memory in medieval Scotland preserved important information. Genealogies maintained property claims. Battle memories inspired resistance. Grievance memories fueled feuds. Collective memories unified groups. Memory was selective and constructed. Forgetting was sometimes necessary. The development of financial instruments in medieval Scotland showed sophistication. Bonds documented long-term obligations. Pledges secured temporary loans. Rentals provided steady income. Financial innovation served elite needs. Most people remained outside financial systems. Finance and power were linked. Cultural resistance in medieval Scotland preserved distinctiveness. Language retention resisted Anglicisation. Customs persisted despite prohibition. Stories preserved alternative values. Material culture maintained identity. Resistance was often subtle. Success required community support. The role of uncertainty in medieval Scottish life was fundamental. Weather was unpredictable. Disease struck randomly. Violence erupted suddenly. Economic conditions changed rapidly. Uncertainty required preparedness. Certainty was illusion. Institutional development in medieval Scotland was slow and uneven. Royal institutions expanded gradually. Church institutions were most developed. Burgh institutions emerged in towns. Guild institutions regulated crafts. Institutions competed for authority. Institutional weakness was common. The concept of commons in medieval Scotland created shared resources. Common lands provided grazing. Common woods supplied fuel. Common waters allowed fishing. Commons required regulation. Enclosure threatened commons. Commons supported poor survival. Power accumulation in medieval Scotland followed patterns. Military success enabled expansion. Marriage alliances consolidated power. Economic resources supported power. Religious authority legitimized power. Power accumulation triggered resistance. Power was unstable. The development of surveillance in medieval Scotland served control functions. Castle towers observed territories. Spies reported on rivals. Priests monitored parishioners. Neighbours watched neighbours. Surveillance was limited but present. Privacy was virtually impossible. Social integration in medieval Scotland varied by context. Religious ceremonies brought communities together. Markets integrated diverse populations. Marriages connected families. Conflicts also created integration. Integration was partial and contested. Segregation persisted alongside integration. The role of tradition invention in medieval Scotland legitimized change. Ancient customs were newly created. Genealogies were fabricated. Historical precedents were invented. Tradition invention served political purposes. Antiquity provided authority. Innovation disguised as tradition. Economic extraction in medieval Scotland transferred resources upward. Rents extracted agricultural surplus. Tithes claimed production shares. Taxes funded elite activities. Labour service appropriated work. Extraction mechanisms were multiple. Resistance to extraction was constant. The concept of sacred time in medieval Scotland structured experience. Sabbath observance suspended work. Holy days marked calendar. Liturgical hours organised days. Sacred time had different rules. Violations brought punishment. Sacred and profane time intersected. Geographic knowledge in medieval Scotland was limited but practical. Local knowledge was detailed. Regional knowledge was sketchy. International knowledge was mythical. Maps were rare and inaccurate. Oral directions were more reliable. Geographic ignorance was dangerous. The development of defensive strategies in medieval Scotland evolved constantly. Castle designs improved against siege weapons. Battle formations adapted to new threats. Alliance systems provided collective security. Intelligence gathering warned of dangers. Defense required constant investment. Perfect defense was impossible. Cultural transmission mechanisms in medieval Scotland preserved knowledge. Apprenticeships transmitted craft skills. Stories preserved historical memory. Songs taught moral lessons. Rituals conveyed religious knowledge. Transmission was imperfect. Much was lost between generations. The role of subsistence strategies in medieval Scotland ensured survival. Diverse food sources reduced risk. Preservation techniques extended availability. Sharing mechanisms distributed resources. Storage provided insurance. Subsistence required constant work. Survival was never guaranteed. Political symbolism in medieval Scotland communicated authority. Crowns represented sovereignty. Swords symbolized justice. Banners identified allegiances. Ceremonies enacted power relationships. Symbols were contested. Symbolism required interpretation. The concept of moral economy in medieval Scotland influenced behaviour. Fair prices were expected. Hoarding was condemned. Charity was obligatory. Exploitation had limits. Moral economy conflicted with market economy. Violations triggered unrest. Network effects in medieval Scotland created advantages and disadvantages. Large networks provided opportunities. Small networks offered security. Network membership required maintenance. Exclusion from networks was devastating. Networks overlapped complexly. Network position mattered. The development of resistance strategies in medieval Scotland showed creativity. Hidden transcripts mocked authority. Foot dragging slowed exploitation. Poaching asserted customary rights. Rebellion was last resort. Resistance was risky but common. Success was rare. Temporal rhythms in medieval Scotland varied by activity. Agricultural time was seasonal. Religious time was daily and weekly. Political time was episodic. Economic time was cyclical. Different times conflicted. Synchronization was difficult. The role of materiality in medieval Scottish society was fundamental. Objects carried social meanings. Materials indicated status. Possession defined identity. Loss was devastating. Materiality and spirituality intersected. Things mattered enormously. Knowledge boundaries in medieval Scotland reinforced hierarchies. Elite knowledge was exclusive. Craft knowledge was restricted. Women's knowledge was marginalized. Secret knowledge provided power. Knowledge boundaries were defended. Transgression was punished. The concept of risk in medieval Scotland shaped decisions. Agricultural risks were seasonal. Commercial risks were calculated. Political risks were constant. Social risks involved reputation. Risk management was primitive. Risk was unavoidable. Institutional competition in medieval Scotland created instability. Royal and baronial courts competed. Secular and church authorities clashed. Burgh and guild institutions contested. Competition weakened authority. Coordination was difficult. Conflict was structural. The development of information management in medieval Scotland was primitive but important. Archives preserved documents. Memories preserved oral information. Symbols condensed complex information. Information was power. Control of information was contested. Most information was lost. Social discipline in medieval Scotland operated through multiple mechanisms. Legal punishments enforced rules. Social pressure ensured conformity. Economic dependence limited options. Religious sanctions threatened souls. Discipline was imperfect but effective. Resistance required courage. The role of liminality in medieval Scottish society marked transitions. Threshold spaces were dangerous. Transition periods required rituals. Marginal people were suspect. Boundaries were powerful. Liminality was temporary but significant. Integration followed separation. Economic cycles in medieval Scotland created rhythms. Boom periods were brief. Bust periods were devastating. Recovery was slow. Cycles were unpredictable. Adaptation was necessary. Stability was illusory. The concept of sovereignty in medieval Scotland was complex. Royal sovereignty was claimed but contested. Local sovereignty persisted. Church sovereignty competed. Popular sovereignty was absent. Sovereignty was divisible. Absolute sovereignty was impossible. Cultural capital in medieval Scotland provided advantages. Education was rare and valuable. Connections opened opportunities. Manners marked status. Language skills enabled advancement. Cultural capital was inherited. Acquisition was difficult. As our exploration of medieval Scotland draws to a close, we see a society of incredible complexity and resilience. These were people who faced challenges we can barely imagine today, yet they created communities, maintained traditions, and slowly built the foundations of modern Scotland. Their struggles shaped the character of a nation that would eventually influence the entire world through its diaspora, its ideas, and its innovations. The medieval period in Scotland wasn't simply a time of darkness waiting for enlightenment. It was an era of human adaptation, creativity, and endurance. Every castle ruin, every ancient document, every traditional song that survives today represents thousands of unnamed individuals who lived, loved, struggled, and died in this harsh but beautiful land. Their legacy lives on not just in stones and parchments, but in the Scottish character itself, resilient, independent, and fiercely protective of identity and freedom. Remember, if you enjoy these soothing historical explorations, please like the video, subscribe to History Candle, and ring the notification bell for more peaceful journeys into the past, and write in comments from which country you're watching this video. Thank you for joining me on this extensive journey through medieval Scotland. May the courage and resilience of those who came before inspire us in our own times, no matter how different our challenges may be.